Imagine being one of the most admired queens of England, only to discover one day that you carry the gene for an inherited disease with no cure, no escape, and that you unknowingly passed it on to your children, who passed it on to their children, and then to other royal families through generations of dynastic marriages, ultimately condemning not only your own bloodline but many others to lives of severe limitation and, quite possibly, an early death. Some of you may already have guessed that we're talking about Queen Victoria, and more specifically her son, Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, who suffered from hemophilia, a cruel and insidious blood disorder. But today's story doesn't begin with them. It begins 50 years earlier. The year is 1803. We're in the small town of Plymouth, New Hampshire. A physician from Philadelphia named John Conrad Otto observes and identifies a family whom he refers to as bleeders. He traces an entire family tree beginning with a woman who had lived in the province going all the way back to 1702, discovering that all of her descendants had inherited a mutation that was passed on to every male member of the family. A mutation that causes bleeding, but more than that, an inability to clot properly. Any wound, even a small cut, can bleed for weeks, and falls that would seem completely harmless to most of us can easily become fatal. No one could have imagined that this gene existed within the British royal family, let alone in Queen Victoria herself. 60 years after Dr. Conrad's discovery, which had remained largely unnoticed all that time, hemophilia began to reveal itself within the walls of Buckingham Palace, and Queen Victoria was forced to confront a sentence from which neither her family nor her descendants could escape. Victoria was born in 1819, and as I mentioned, no one could have imagined that she carried a blood disorder that would later become known as the royal disease. At the time, hemophilia was barely understood. It had hardly been studied and was almost invisible to the medical world. For Victoria, everything seemed to be unfolding just perfectly. Court life was always busy, and it's important to point out that before Leopold, Queen Victoria had already given birth to 7 children, including 3 sons, Prince Edward, Prince Alfred, and Prince Arthur. None of her older sons showed any symptoms or signs of the disease. Then, fast forward to 1853. Victoria was 34 years old, and on April 7th of that year she gave birth to her 8th child and 4th son, born from her marriage to Prince Albert. From the very beginning, Prince Leopold was described as a baby with a noticeably more delicate appearance. Queen Victoria was constantly surrounded by physicians, being the most important figure in Victorian England, and from the very start they recorded several medical observations that would later prove significant. From the accounts left by Victoria's doctors, we know that one of their first concerns was her use of chloroform during childbirth. Chloroform was administered to reduce labour pain, and one of the physicians wrote that each time she experienced pain, he would place 5 carefully measured drops onto a folded handkerchief before allowing her to inhale it. Queen Victoria fully approved of this method, as it's well known that she disliked experiencing pain of any kind. Victoria's mother, however, the Duchess of Kent, was the first to suspect that something wasn't quite right with Leopold, and she blamed the chloroform, having no knowledge whatsoever of haemophilia at the time. In one of her letters she described Leopold by writing that the poor little creature appears so delicate, adding that it filled her with anxiety. Historical sources tell us that just 3 days after his birth, the infant had already begun experiencing serious feeding difficulties. Faced with these problems, Victoria remained characteristically optimistic, but even she found it increasingly difficult to ignore Leopold's heartbreaking cries. Those initial concerns eased somewhat after a new wet nurse was appointed for him, and he soon began sleeping much better. It's important to state that most cases of haemophilia were usually diagnosed during childhood, but Leopold's condition took a couple more years before revealing itself. As a result, the first years of his life were relatively peaceful, despite a number of physical issues. He was christened on June 28th, and his godparents were King George V of Hanover, Augusta of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach, and Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge. He was slow to speak, his development was delayed, and even his teething came later than expected, but he was nevertheless an intelligent child. His childhood was spent between the magnificent surroundings of Buckingham Palace and Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, where the royal family enjoyed holidays and family life away from the formalities of court. These residences perfectly reflected the vision Queen Victoria and Prince Albert shared of a modern monarchy. Albert, in particular, had a profound influence on the upbringing of his children. He placed enormous importance on their intellectual and moral education from a very young age, serving as an essential paternal guide until his premature death on December 14th, 1861, when Leopold was only 8 years old. Victoria suddenly found herself facing widowhood alone while also having to oversee the upbringing of her younger son. From everything we know, Leopold was regarded as the youngest and most cherished child of the family. Queen Victoria, already known for her strong maternal devotion, became even more affectionate and protective toward him after Albert's death. Personally, I believe that the grief which struck the family led Queen Victoria to observe Leopold even more closely than before. She began paying greater attention to the episodes and symptoms that had accompanied him since birth, gradually realizing that they might not simply be part of his normal development, but rather signs of something that required a deeper medical explanation. Albert's death was an enormous blow to the Queen. She spent much of her time at Windsor Castle and withdrew from public life for a period, overwhelmed by grief over the loss of her husband. Leopold, meanwhile, spent his days under his mother's constant supervision. She most likely found comfort and companionship in her youngest son during those difficult years. Leopold was only 8 years old, but from the medical reports and the many letters we consulted, we know that the bleeding episodes had begun much earlier and had simply gone unnoticed. Today we can confidently say that Leopold's haemophilia first revealed itself when he was around 2 years old. We're talking about the summer of 1855, when a hemorrhagic episode was recorded in the medical notes but was initially mistaken for scarlet fever, a disease that had in fact affected several of his siblings around that time. In the years that followed, recurring bruises, spontaneous bleeding episodes, and swelling in his joints became increasingly common, causing growing concern. A clearer diagnosis finally emerged between 1858 and 1859, when Leopold was 5 years old. Once he began walking more regularly, it became obvious that he bruised with remarkable ease. This is the first time Queen Victoria herself mentions her son's condition in writing. In a letter to Leopold I of Belgium dated August 2, 1859, she wrote, "Your poor little namesake is again laid up with a bad knee from a fall, which appeared to be of no consequence. It is very sad for the poor child, for really I fear he will never be able to enter any active service. This unfortunate defect is often not outgrown, and no remedy or medicine does it any good." By then, the clinical picture had become increasingly clear. Excessive bleeding even after very minor injuries, painful joint damage affecting especially his knees and ankles, and a general physical weakness all pointed in the same direction. 3 members of Queen Victoria's medical team, Dr. John Wickham Legge, Dr. Arnold Royal and Sir James Clark, carefully observed Leopold's symptoms before reaching the devastating conclusion that he suffered from haemophilia, an inherited disease for which there was no cure. But what exactly is haemophilia? And if we know that Leopold inherited it from Queen Victoria, where did Queen Victoria inherit it from? Let's take a moment to understand what we're talking about and what Leopold and others were dealing with. Haemophilia is a rare inherited blood disorder that primarily affects males born to women who carry the defective gene. Women are generally carriers of the mutation without showing the severe symptoms that usually appear in men. Thanks to numerous modern genetic studies, we now know that Queen Victoria did not inherit haemophilia from either of her parents. Instead, the mutation appears to have arisen spontaneously. There is no evidence that anyone on either her mother's or her father's side had ever suffered from the disease. The most likely explanation is that the mutation occurred in the germline of her father, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent. Modern geneticists have reconstructed with remarkable precision not only how the disease first appeared, but also how it eventually spread throughout many of Europe's royal dynasties, not just the British royal family. Queen Victoria, as the carrier, unknowingly passed the mutated gene onto several of her children. The first was Leopold. She also passed the gene to 2 of her daughters, Princess Alice and Princess Beatrice. Like Victoria herself, neither of them developed the disease, but both became healthy carriers. Through their marriages into other royal houses, Alice and Beatrice spread the mutation across Europe, introducing it into Spanish, German and Russian royal families, including the Romanovs. Even today, there is still no definitive cure for haemophilia, although medicine has made extraordinary progress. During the 1850s and 1860s, however, treatment was extremely limited and focused only on managing the symptoms. Patients were prescribed prolonged periods of rest to reduce the risk of further bleeding, ice compressors were applied to swollen joints, and morphine was administered to relieve severe pain. Bloodletting, fortunately, was for once avoided, as it would only have made the condition dramatically worse. The leading physicians of the period, including those I mentioned earlier, played an important role in attempting to care for Leopold. Sir James Clark, Queen Victoria's personal physician, and also Prince Albert's doctor, remained involved in Leopold's care throughout his life. Owing to his close relationship with the Queen, he also helped conceal the true nature of Leopold's illness. It is said that when describing Leopold's health, he often used wording that had been suggested directly by Queen Victoria herself. He also carried out some of the earlier studies aimed at understanding haemophilia. He observed that the blood of haemophiliacs took an unusually long time to clot, but believed that this alone could not fully explain the disease, since bleeding episodes often occurred without any obvious injury. He theorized instead that people with haemophilia produced blood more rapidly than normal, and possessed an unusually large number of tiny blood vessels. Another important physician was Dr. John Wickham Legge, a student of Jenner who remained closely connected to Leopold throughout his medical career. Legge did not paint a particularly optimistic picture of haemophilia in his medical writings. He noted that some physicians believed haemophiliacs possessed exceptional intellectual abilities, but he dismissed that idea entirely, insisting there was no evidence to support it. On the contrary, he argued that haemophiliacs sometimes appeared to develop what he described as more feminine characteristics, largely because they were unable to participate in sports or other physical activities. In many ways, this description matched Leopold's own experience. One of Legge's most striking opinions concerned marriage. He wrote, "Should a haemophiliac, or even a member of a haemophiliac family, be allowed to marry? In my opinion, where haemophilia is concerned, the question of marriage should not even be considered. The certainty of passing on such a dreadful hereditary disease ought to discourage any reasonable person from taking such a step." What do you think about this point? I'm truly interested in knowing your thought on this. As for treatment, Legge strongly advised against blood draws, surgical procedures, amputations, and prolonged exposure to cold or damp climates. He believed that applying pressure to bleeding wounds, using ice, and compressing the main arteries could help slow severe hemorrhages. He also recommended that haemophiliacs, including Leopold, spend as much time as possible in warm climates. Legge himself wrote, "A sadder heritage of disease could scarcely be entailed." Leopold often had to be carried from place to place because his overall health remained fragile. Nevertheless, once he had passed early childhood, he was able to begin his education. Doctors advised that he spend the winters somewhere warmer, and for that reason he was sent to France. Yet even travel was dangerous. Every journey carried risks that healthy people never had to think about. At best, these trips offered only temporary relief rather than any real treatment. We can honestly say that Leopold's everyday life had already been completely transformed by his illness. In 1862, while the royal family was travelling to Coburg, Leopold accidentally injured the roof of his mouth with a steel pen nib. The bleeding proved almost impossible to stop. Victoria was deeply distressed, and in a letter to the Princess Royal she described the incident by writing, "He has not lost as much blood as he did on previous occasions, but I feared the bleeding simply would not stop, and you know as well as I do that if it hadn't, he could not possibly have survived." Fortunately, a surgeon in Berlin managed to stop the hemorrhage. From that point onward, Victoria became even more attached to Leopold and wanted him constantly by her side. Around the age of 10, he suffered an internal hemorrhage following what had been only a minor fall from his horse. After that incident, horseback riding was forbidden altogether. As you can probably imagine, Leopold felt profoundly alone. His life was filled with limitations, and so many of the activities his brothers enjoyed were completely off limits to him. Several accounts tell us that he spent entire days crying. To help ease his loneliness, the family gave him a dachshund named Waldy, who quickly became his inseparable companion. Sadly, not long afterward, Leopold also began suffering from epileptic seizures. Epilepsy was considered an even more serious condition than haemophilia, and it had an enormous impact on his adult life, especially when it came to finding a suitable wife. These illnesses also prevented him from pursuing the traditional careers expected of a royal prince, such as serving in the army or the Royal Navy. Rather than giving up, however, Leopold chose a different path. In many ways, he became a pioneer of what we would now call modern royal public service, using both his title and his education to support charitable, artistic and social causes. In January 1868, Leopold suffered another extremely severe epileptic seizure, and for the first time those around him genuinely feared he would not survive. Queen Victoria later wrote, "From that day forward, I felt that this beloved son, who had been restored to me from the very edge of the grave, must become the chief purpose of my life." The following summer, mother and son travelled together to Switzerland, but the next year proved to be another terrible one for Leopold's health. By Christmas, he was once again confined to bed, and in 1870 he developed yet another serious problem with his knee. This time, Leopold himself described his condition in one of his letters. "I am deeply discouraged by my condition. No sooner had I recovered from my last exhausting illness and begun moving about again than I found myself confined to bed once more. His only real comforts were music, books, and letter writing." In 1874, Leopold came of age. He celebrated his birthday in a relative solitude, as very few members of the family were actually present. Soon afterward, he suffered yet another serious attack. He was unable to walk, and in July he badly injured one of his knees. Following that incident, he developed an extremely high fever and fell into delirium. At one point, rumours even began circulating that he had died. Finally, on August 11th, after nearly a month, his temperature returned to normal, and he appeared to recover, although he remained deeply depressed. After turning 18, Leopold was expected to attend Oxford. Victoria, however, was reluctant to let him go and eventually agreed only under very strict conditions. He left home and settled there, but before long he began suffering repeated internal hemorrhages. When he returned home that December, he was moving from room to room in a wheelchair. By January, his condition had become so critical that people once again feared for his life. Remarkably, he survived once more. Then, around February 21st, he suffered another seizure while holding a pair of scissors. During the attack, he accidentally cut the fingers of his right hand. The wounds would not stop bleeding. It seemed as though the hemorrhage would never end, and the doctors were eventually forced to cauterize the cuts by burning them closed, an incredibly painful procedure. Even after all of this, Leopold still wanted to return to Oxford. It was almost as though he had accepted that pain would always be part of his life. Despite everything, both Leopold himself and Queen Victoria later described his years at Oxford as some of the happiest and most positive of his life. Leopold was also appointed to several military positions, although they were purely honorary. Because of his illness, he was limited to administrative duties and ceremonial appearances rather than active military service or combat. Reading his biography in detail, one cannot help noticing just how profoundly limiting his illness truly was. Imagine being a British prince in Victorian England, while watching your brothers pursue distinguished military and naval careers, earning honours and recognition that you knew would forever remain beyond your reach. It must have been an extraordinarily difficult burden to carry, psychologically as much as physically. His illness also severely restricted his social life. Sports and outdoor activities, where young aristocrats typically formed friendships and social connections, were forbidden to him. As a result, Leopold grew up isolated, and that sense of exclusion remained with him well into adulthood. This also deepened his dependence on his family, especially on his mother, reinforcing the image of him as someone who was almost semi-invalid. Perhaps this is also where Leopold's strong desire to find a wife and build a family of his own truly began. He longed for a degree of independence, for a life that would allow him to step, at least a little, out from beneath the constant protection of a mother who loved him deeply, but could also be overwhelmingly protective. Even then, however, both his haemophilia and his suspected epilepsy created enormous obstacles in his search for a bride. Several early marriage prospects fell through because the families involved feared the hereditary risks associated with his health, making negotiations with Europe's royal houses extremely difficult. Queen Victoria herself was initially opposed to allowing her son to marry because of his fragile condition, although she eventually became actively involved in helping him find a suitable match. During the summer of 1881, Leopold's attention turned to Princess Helen of Waldeck and Pyrmont, the daughter of Prince George Victor of Waldeck and Pyrmont. Their meeting had been arranged by Queen Victoria herself and took place that September. A courtship soon followed, and the couple officially became engaged. In a letter to his brother-in-law, Grand Duke Louis IV of Hesse, Leopold expressed overwhelming joy, describing himself as mad with happiness. The wedding took place shortly afterward, on April 27, 1882, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. Their marriage proved to be a loving and respectful union. Helen devoted herself wholeheartedly to her husband, caring for him through the many health crises that continued to define his life: joint pain, repeated hemorrhages caused by his haemophilia, and long periods of recovery remained constant companions. Together they led a quiet domestic life, and Helen's gentle temperament gave Leopold a sense of stability that became incredibly precious during what would sadly be a very short marriage. The recurring complications caused by haemophilia continued, and as Leopold grew older, the disease progressed further. Repeated bleeding episodes resulted in chronic joint pain, deformities in his limbs, and increasingly limited mobility. At times, even more than during his childhood, he was forced to spend entire weeks confined to bed. Despite Leopold's constant suffering, Helen gradually settled into this new life beside him. She learned to live with his illness and all that it demanded. Then, while Leopold was going through yet another serious decline in his health, Helen discovered she was expecting their first child. On February 25, 1883, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl who was named Alice. Alice inherited the haemophilia gene and became a carrier, just like her grandmother Queen Victoria. The following year, Helen discovered she was pregnant once again. Around the same time, Leopold planned yet another of the regular trips he made to the south of France, in the hope that the warmer climate would help stabilise his condition. He had hoped Helen would accompany him to Cannes, but during her pregnancy she became ill, and both of them feared she might suffer a miscarriage. In the end, Leopold allowed himself to be persuaded to travel alone. He left reassured by the fact that both Helen and little Alice no longer appeared to be in immediate danger. He departed on February 21st, completely unaware that he would never see his wife again. On March 27th, while hurrying back to his room one afternoon, Leopold slipped on the floor. As he fell, he struck his head and hit his right knee against the final step of the staircase. He was given morphine and sent to bed to rest. That evening he wrote to Helen, "Darling, you shall know the whole truth every day. I do not mind the pain, I have very little at the moment, but the idea of you unhappy, perhaps crying, at Claremont joined to my horrible disappointment at not coming home, makes me howl. Death would be preferable to this." During the night, his physician found him suffering violent convulsions. Unsure of what else to do, he threw cold water across Leopold's face in a desperate attempt to revive him. Leopold had escaped death countless times before, but this time there would be no miracle. When the physician finally realised what had happened, he immediately sent a telegram to Queen Victoria's doctor at Windsor. It read, "Sudden seizures unrelated to the fall, pulse collapsing, we are devastated." His doctors ultimately concluded that, because of his haemophilia, what would not normally have been considered a fatal fall had caused a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Queen Victoria was utterly devastated by the news. Leopold was the second of her children to die. 6 years earlier she had lost her daughter Alice, and now her youngest son had been taken from her as well. He was only 30 years old, the first to die this soon. In her journal, Queen Victoria wrote, "Another awful blow has fallen upon me and all of us today. My beloved Leopold, that bright, clever son, who had so many times recovered from such fearful illness and from various small accidents, has been taken from us. To lose another dear child far from me, and one who was so gifted and such a help to me, is too dreadful." The news was met with deep sadness throughout Britain as well, for Leopold was widely admired and genuinely loved by the public. His funeral was held privately on April 5, 1884, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. He was first laid to rest in the royal vault beneath the chapel, before his remains were later transferred to the Albert Memorial Chapel on June 23, 1885. Although Leopold's life was marked by extraordinary suffering, loneliness, and a constant sense of isolation and inadequacy, his story became enormously important from a medical perspective. Through his case, later generations of physicians and geneticists were able to better understand how haemophilia was inherited and how it spread throughout Europe's royal families. countless modern studies have been carried out thanks to the documentation surrounding his life, giving us a far greater understanding of what it truly means to live with this disease. Hemophilia has still not been cured, but modern therapies have transformed it into a condition that can now be managed in ways that were unimaginable during Leopold's lifetime. In the Romanov family, the male line carrying the disease came to an end on July 16, 1918, when 13-year-old Alexei was murdered alongside his family. His sisters, who may themselves have been carriers, died with him. In the Spanish branch, the disease disappeared naturally after the deaths of Princes Alfonso and Gonzalo, both of whom suffered from haemophilia. They died in 1938 and 1934 respectively, and with them that line of affected males came to an end. Finally, within the British and German branches descended from Princess Alice and Prince Leopold, most of the affected descendants died at a relatively young age during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The members of today's British royal family descend from the healthy line of King Edward VII, Queen Victoria's eldest son, who did not inherit the haemophilia mutation. A DNA analysis carried out in 2009 on the remains of the Romanov family finally confirmed that the genetic mutation introduced by Queen Victoria was the rare form known as haemophilia B. Today, thanks to extraordinary medical advances, haemophilia no longer significantly reduces life expectancy. The tragic history of the disease has not been forgotten, but thankfully it no longer has to end the way it did for Prince Leopold.